Okay, so you've waited 24 hours or more, you've put your starter in a nice warm spot like on top of your refrigerator or up in a high cabinet. You're starting to see some bubbling and some activity, it's exciting. What's the next step? So now we're ready to actually feed our starter. And this is the basic process I follow when I feed my starter. So this is the one I just put together. This is a starter that I put together a couple of days ago and have been feeding, and it's fairly hungry, it's ready to be fed. So the first step I'm going to take here, and this may seem a little bit strange, is I'm actually going to discard most of this starter. I'm going to keep very little left in this jar. And the reason for that is I don't want to go through unnecessary quantities of flour just to maintain my starter. Because remember, we're trying to keep a constant ratio in place of flour to water to starter. And so by discarding the starter, we actually reduce the amount of overall flour we have to go through. So, like I mentioned in the last video, you'll see a lot of different recipes calling for, 1 part flour to 1 part water to 1 part starter. That's completely fine. I personally enjoy keeping a smaller amount of starter in each feeding. And what that does is it keeps the starter kind of sweeter, it keeps it less on the sour side, and of course that flavor is going to come through in my bread as well, and everything else I make with my starter. So because my family and I tend to prefer less sour, more kind of mild sweet flavors in our bread, I tend to discard most of my starter, keeping about an 1/8 ratio relative to the amount of water and flour in the mix. Again, if you prefer a more sour starter, keep a 1/4 or even a 1/2, or even a 1-to-1 ratio is totally fine. Just keep in mind that this is going to be slightly different texture than mine is, which is totally okay, but it's going to be more in line with what you're after in terms of flavor. So, like I said, I'm going to discard most of this down, keeping only a couple of tablespoons. Okay, so for this first feeding, I'm actually going to be transferring the small amount of starter from my jar into a clean jar. You can also feed right in the existing jar, just be sure to scrape down the edges really well, just so that you're not getting anything that's drying out and developing funky flavors. But just to demonstrate the ratios here, this is going to be the easiest method. So, I'm going to take, and again, so I'm after a sort of 1 part flour to 1 part starter, or excuse me, 1 part flour to 1 part water to about an 1/8 part starter. That's the ratio that I'm going to be using here. So if I plan to use 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, I want probably about, so it's going to be 200 grams total, and I want an 1/8 part of that, so I'm going to be after sort of like 15 grams, something like that. So let's go ahead and add that into my jar here. If you're doing this by volume, I would recommend doing sort of 1 to 2 tablespoons in the bottom is plenty, and then feeding that with a cup of water and about 2 cups of flour to keep it the same ratios. Okay, so that is going to be plenty, and you can see that's not very much starter at all. But really we just need a small amount because this is going to be so chock full of yeast and bacteria. There's plenty of action there for it to really eat a lot of flour once we add our fresh flour to the mix. So I'm going to zero out my scale. Now I'm going to add my water. So like I said, we're going to do 100 grams of water just like we did the first time. Awesome. And now we want our 50 grams of all-purpose flour, 50 grams of whole wheat flour, just like last time. And I'm actually going to use a spoon this time because I might make slightly less of a mess. And so, like I said, one thing I want to mention too, this is sort of the first step you take in maintaining your starter. You're kind of switching this thing over to a constant feeding schedule. And it's important during these kind of first 3 to 6 days especially to be really vigilant about this, because this is where the starter is kind of at its most fragile. It's young. A common question I get is, what can I do with this stuff, the stuff that I made the first time? This is what we call, it's commonly referred to as discard or discarded starter. It's starter that you're not keeping around for the future. And so there's a number of things you can do with it, but the important thing to realize is that unless that starter is kind of fully activated and bubbly and happy, it's not going to be able to produce things like really fluffy pancakes or brownies or other things that you're using discarded starter for. So So you might have to really throw this out the first couple of days, but once your starter is up and running, it's going to be no problem at all for you to keep this starter on hand and use it in any way you like. So I'm just going to finish adding my whole wheat flour here. Perfect. And now I'm ready to mix again. Just taking a clean fork, I'm just going to bring this all together. And since we had that starter in the bottom of the jar, you want to make sure you're really scraping up and doing a nice job of incorporating that so you're not getting little pockets of starter throughout. And one thing I want to mention as well, if you're doing this in the future and you're not sure whether to add a little bit more water or flour, my advice is make sure that this is plenty hydrated, because it's the water in the mix that allows the yeast mobility through the entire mixture. They need that water in order to travel around and consume the fresh flour in the mix. So if in doubt, add a touch more water and just start it gradually, and eventually you're going to get to a texture like this one, which is just perfect. I can stir it easily. And like I said, if I tip this over, it's still going to pull away from the jar, which is exactly what I'm after. Okay, so that's our first feeding. It's just that simple. And at this point, I'm going to borrow my clean cover from my demo here. Put it back on. And this is going to go back into a warm spot, probably on top of my fridge, and I'll check on it in 12 hours. So now let's address the all-important question, which is how often should I feed my starter? And the unhelpful answer here is it depends. Keep in mind that starters are very sensitive to a number of things, humidity and temperature especially. So because every starter is a little bit unique and everyone's homes are unique, your schedule might vary a little bit. And you'll over time have to figure out what works best for you and for your starter in your home environment. There's a couple of basic guidelines we can follow though. Keep in mind that during the summer season when our rooms are warmer, starters tend to feed and ferment a little bit faster. So that means feeding them more regularly is a great idea. So maybe that means feeding them every 6 hours or 8 hours or 12 hours. It really just depends, but you want to be looking for the starter to really substantially rise and bubble and get very vigorous. That's a sign that it's sort of at its peak height and you're ready to discard and feed again or to bake with it. If your room is on the colder side, like mine is during this time of year, there's a couple of things we can do. We can go longer between feedings, maybe that's 12 to 16 hours even, or we can also control this through our water temperature. So if I wanted this starter to be on a more regular schedule of say 8 to 12 hours, I could just mix with slightly warmer water. And vice versa, if you're looking to slow things down a little bit, feed your starter with cooler water. This is the best means we have to really control the rate at which our fermentation is occurring, just by manipulating the temperature of our water and our environment. Another common and important question is how do I know when my starter is ready to bake with? And so there's a couple of tests we can run to determine whether your starter is ready to bake with. One of them is called the float test, where basically you just take a spoonful of your starter and drop it in a bowl of water. And if your starter floats on the surface, that's a great sign that there's a lot of activity and air in your starter, which is a good sign that it's ready to be baked with. So that's not the only test though, and I would encourage you to make sure you just trust that if your starter is bubbling super actively, if it's increasing in size overnight or between feedings, that's a great sign that there's a lot of activity in there. So you should probably go ahead and try to bake something with it. It's going to turn out just fine. Another question I get is how can I tell when my starter is hungry? Well, it's very similar to testing whether it's ready to be baked with. If it's passing the float test or if you're seeing just super aggressive bubbling and activity there, that's a good sign that your starter is very active and is probably at its peak and is going to be ready for more food soon. Another indication that your starter is hungry is if you're seeing a layer of liquid along the surface. And this liquid is basically a form of ethanol, which is commonly referred to as hooch. This is just a sign that your bacteria and yeast have really run out of food. They're starting to get really, really hungry. It's not a sign that your starter's dead by any means. It's just a sign that it's definitely ready for some fresh food. So you have two options when you see hooch develop. You can either pour it off into your sink and then discard and feed your starter as usual, or you can mix it into your starter And the real difference there is just how sour you like your starter to be. Mixing the hooch in is going to make it much more sour, more pungent. Dumping it off is going to keep your starter more on the mild side. I want to give you just a few more suggestions for how to keep your starter warm, because this is especially crucial during this first week and beyond, especially during the cooler times of year. So places that I like the top of my refrigerator. It's a little bit higher in my room. It's going to have the heat rising from behind the refrigerator and just in my room in general. So that's a really great spot where I can keep an eye on it and keep track of how it's doing. Other ways you could keep this starter warm are, looking for high places in your room is a great idea. Or you could take a insulated cooler or a box and put a couple of jars of warm water in there as well and create a little bit of a microclimate for it. That's a great technique as well for keeping your starter warm when your home is on the cool side. One last thing to address is, of course, I'm using a breathable cover here, and I recommend you do this for the first week, and a couple of weeks actually would probably be a good idea. In the future though, you can feel free to use a solid cap on your jar. The advantages to doing that is, of course, if you have a very active, rigorous starter, it's going to prevent it from completely blowing through this cover and overflowing on your countertop. Believe me, I've done that a few times in the past. But be careful with a solid lid, it is going to develop pressure. So when you go to release it, you might want to just release a little bit of air at a time so it doesn't also explode all over your countertop. But for long-term maintenance, I don't see a huge difference between using a breathable cover and a solid cover. Once this thing is active and happy, there's plenty of yeast and bacteria in there without the need of a breathable cover to maintain it in the future.